Hello, students. Welcome to Module 1 of the Philosophy Essay Bootcamp. Our goals for this module are the following. By the end of this module, you'll be able to unpack a visual stimulus, unpack a textual stimulus, create a focused question, and write a stimulus linking paragraph. Why are we doing this? Always a good question. Well, the first inspiration for this is simply the paper 1A mark scheme. I will draw your attention to the second little dot here, which says the philosophical issue raised by the stimulus material is explicitly identified. There is a well-developed justification of how the issue relates to the stimulus material and to the question of what it is to be human. Well, you couldn't ask for a better justification for this module. It's something we all need to do, and it's something we might all too often forget to do when we're writing our essay. But the value of this goes beyond simply paper 1A. Now, paper 1A is the only one that requires the link to the core theme of what it is to be a human being, but there are other uses for this. For DP1s, this is a great practice for your internal assessment, because in that internal assessment, you're also going to have to derive a philosophical issue from a non-philosophical stimulus. So that could be almost anything. And including text and images. For HLs, paper 3 gives you a stimulus and asks you to create your own question about philosophy itself. And it also requires an opening paragraph in which you talk about what issue you found in the stimulus and what you want to explore, and you have to generate a question. So it's useful for paper 3. Paper 1B questions, though a bit more focused, still sometimes require unpacking because they tend to be very big and you need to learn to focus down on just one aspect. And even paper 2B has this similar quality where it asks you a relatively big question about an idea in the prescribed text, and then you need to figure out what aspect of it you want to talk about. So basically, although this practice is focused on paper 1A, the same skills are applicable directly to your internal assessment, directly to paper 3, and at least in part to paper 1B and paper 2B. So if that's not justification enough for you, don't know what to say. This should be useful in all respects. So how do we unpack a stimulus? Well, there are 4 steps. 1, identify an interesting part of the stimulus. You don't try to do the whole stimulus, you look at a part of the stimulus. 2, identify a philosophical concept in the stimulus, preferably one that attaches to that interesting part. 3, create an explicit link between the two. And 4, establish a link to the core theme. Even if it's obvious, you should sometimes spell this out. Now, I find that the best way to do this is to try to get down to a question, but the IB doesn't require that you have a question. I just think it works that way. So in my examples, I'm going to be deriving questions, but you could also just look at concepts. All right, so let's see, what does this look like? How can we do this? So here we have a visual stimulus. Oh my, this is the creation, yeah? So identify an interesting part of the stimulus. Well, there's so many interesting parts here. I could talk about God and man being created. I could talk about all sorts of different why there are all these other things in here, and heck, I could talk about almost anything. There's lots of interesting stuff here, but the thing that interests me is something that actually I saw in a TV show called oh, what is it? No, I forgot it. Oh, Westworld. Duh, Westworld. This notion that this outline here looks a lot like a cross section of the human brain, and I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, and that idea has stuck with me a lot ever since. So that's the interesting part that I'm going to look at, is the fact that this looks like a cross section of the human brain. All right, identify a philosophical concept in the stimulus. Well, this is God creating man, yeah, in his own image, supposedly. Now, this could, be the image of like we look like God. God's a dude with a beard, but I kind of like this idea of, this is the mind, right? This is the brain. And so the part of us that's in God's own image is the mind. So to create an explicit link between the two, I would like to phrase it in the form of a question. So basically, Oh, if God is creating man in his own image and God is being depicted as basically a flying brain, then is our mind, in particular our reason, divine? Seems like a good question. And then we establish a link to the core theme. All right, so the link to the core theme would be, well, if human beings have reason, well, that seems like a distinctly human characteristic, which means that it would make sense if we found out if reason, being a distinctly human characteristic, is divine. That would tell us if man is divine, at least in part. So now that I've done this, I can then write a paragraph. This will be the final product that you'll create for this module. So here's my stimulus. Here's my paragraph. In this stimulus, let me move my head over here. There we go. Moving head. In this stimulus, we see God bestowing his divine gift to Adam. According to the Bible, God created man in his own image. What strikes me about this picture is that the cloak and area surrounding God looks a lot like a cross-section of the human brain. Bing, I've identified the interesting part of the stimulus. This suggests that the divine part of man, the part that is in God's image, is our mind. This leads me to wonder about human nature, in particular our minds. Ding, a philosophical concept. And leads me to question, is human reason a divine gift? Ding, I have now made an explicit link between the two in the form of a question. And finally, as reason is often thought of as a distinctly human quality, answering this question will tell me a great deal about humans and our place in the world. Ding! I've established a link to the core theme. Behold, it is that simple. Let's try it again with a text. Here's the preamble from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, what can I do with this? Well, first I'll identify an interesting part of the stimulus. Move myself up a bit here. There's so much cool stuff in here. There's the notion of a self-evident truth, but that's maybe a little bit far from the core theme. There's the stuff about rights, and yeah, I could talk about rights in terms of personhood, maybe. But what I really like here is this all men are created equal bit. So that's the part that I'm going to look at. That's my interesting part. All right, next, identify a philosophical concept in the stimulus. Well, it's pretty much straightforward. All men are created equal. I have two cool philosophical concepts. Are men created? Are we a creation of a god? Or I could also look at, are we equal? And of the two, I think are we equal is a more interesting question. So that is my philosophical concept, and I'll make an explicit link. Basically, my question is, are men all created equal? And I got to look at, well, what is the stimulus talking about? The stimulus is probably talking about rights, but I could talk about other forms of equality. So I could mean equality in terms of we have equal rights, or equality in terms of we have equal capacities, or equality, I don't know, that we're just like straight up the same. So there's different ways that I could look at this, but they all are potentially linked to the stimulus. And finally, I have established a link to the core theme. Are all men created equal? It's pretty obvious, so I won't have to put too much work into making that link. So let me move my head over here again. I'll be over the thing. All right, so here's my paragraph. The preamble of the Declaration of Independence is a treasure trove of Enlightenment philosophy. There are a number of interesting concepts in here, like self-evident truths and rights. Yet the part that catches my eye is the first of these self-evident truths, that all men are created equal. Ding! I've identified the interesting part of the stimulus. I have often wondered if all human beings are indeed equal. I suppose it depends upon the sense of the world. So, ding, identify a philosophical concept in the stimulus. Are men all created equal? Are we equal in terms of rights, or equal in terms of capacity, or equal or to become whatever we want to be? Equal in terms of being, are we equal in terms of being the same, equal in terms of rights, or equal in terms of capacity to become whatever we want to be? Nice, strong link between the stimulus and my question. Each of these could make an interesting essay or a book, but I will focus on just one. Are all humans equal in terms of their capacity? Now, see, I've wandered away from the original, but because I looked at various ways that this could be looked at and tied it in with rights, now I've made my link to the stimulus and I am free to wander away from it a bit. Yeah? So, answering this question will grant me a deeper insight into human nature and thus what it means to be human. Link to the core theme. It's a little bit of a cheap line, but if you don't throw it in there, you risk something that's obvious to you not being obvious to your examiner. Whereas if you just say it, then they're like, oh, well, he said it.